Thank you very much, Raymond, and thank you very much for inviting me to this fascinating event. I am not an expert in financial literacy, so by that I mean that I'm not part of any of the studies that Lucas has quoted in his presentation. I have, however, followed the results of financial literacy for many years. Actually, Anna Maria's work with her colleagues is something that I followed for maybe 20 years now, and I have always found, from a common sense perspective, that the results that come out of it are not only intuitive, but they're very, very useful. I come to financial literacy from the macro perspective, and one of the topics in macroeconomics that I have been fascinated by is this idea of how we prepare for uncertainty. How do we deal with events that we don't know are coming, and how do we judge now, from a policy perspective, how well we are prepared for them? That's another way of thinking of ways of increasing the resilience of systems, increasing the robustness of our structures. And of course, with the instant of financial crisis, the issue of resilience and robustness has become center stage. And at any point since then, we are now 10 years from the financial crisis, and we are very much asking the questions, well, are we well prepared now? Are we better prepared now than we were 10 years ago? And for what? What is it that we are preparing for? What kind of events can hit us that we need to think about? And so resilience is really the topic that I am interested in. And I think of resilience, of how you prepare a system for unlikely but catastrophic events from two perspectives. The one is the top-down. That's, if you like, how a macroeconomist would do that. So how do I organize my system from the top down, from the policy perspective, in order to meet challenges? But you can think of resilience coming from bottom up, and this is exactly where I think financial resilience comes in. And in fact, about 2 years ago, when I first joined Breugel, in the midst of designing sort of the new systems in the European Union of preparing for the future, I was stricken by the fact that how little we talk about financial resilience, and therefore also financial education and the role of financial in building this robustness of the system from both directions. We talk a lot about the top down, we talk a lot less from the bottom up, and this is very much my motivation for writing the report that I wrote, and I think the reason why I'm here today, even though I am an unlikely person to think about this. So I will be your ambassador for financial resilience, and then in that report, what I was trying to say, always from the macro perspective, is what is it that we know about financial literacy in terms of how it helps the macro, and why we should care. So I will give you just a snapshot of a few graphs of my logic. I'm not trying to tell a coherent story. I'm only trying to interest you in thinking about financial literacy, not only in the way that Anna Maria did in the beginning, which is, I think, fascinating, not only in the way that Lucas presented earlier, but also from the top down. It matters for the economy. It matters for the robustness of our systems. And I come to how do I move forward? Oh, yeah. I come to this, and I use that also always as a motivation for telling us this. We need to think about the way that we understand finance. We need to think of how we teach that and how we understand it. This is a graph that, it's not my graph, it's a graph that Professor Reinhardt, she's very famous for all the work that she has done on indebtedness. And she always uses that graph, which is basically the level of fiscal debts that we see on average in advanced economies historically from the 1900s to today. So this is the level of debt that governments have. And what you see here is two clear peaks in this debts. The first one is at the end of the Second World War, and is basically how governments have levered in order to finance that war. And the second one is today. And this is exactly where we are today from the fiscal side, so the government debt that they have built up. And typically when she presents this graph, then she stops and she says, I put it to you that the level of indebtedness, to the extent that could be thought of as a problem, is much worse today than it was back at the end of the 40s, simply because we now have private debts. Back in the end of the Second World War, there were no private debts. They were all delevered, but now we have huge private debts. And this is basically a picture of where we are right now in the EU in terms of private indebtedness. So the yellow line and the yellow diamonds that you see there are the fiscal debts that you saw in the previous graph. On average, at the EU, we have a fiscal debt which is about 60–70% of GDP. So it's about 0.6 of what we produce in 1 year. That's the level of fiscal debts. Where the level of private debts, and private debts mean the debts that households have, so you and me, as well as the firms, not the banks. That's a different story. That's the average blue line, and the average blue line is at around 150. So it's more than double the fiscal debt. So if you think of indebtedness as just basically one pot, you can actually take, add the 70 to the 150, and you have more than twice the output that we produce in Europe on average is actually the size of indebtedness. There are huge differences between countries, and the reds are the US, and therefore there is different stories to be told here. But I think what's important to understand here is, first of all, should we care? So what if we have 3 times the debts? I mean, is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? And here I would really like to urge you to think of debt not necessarily as a bad thing. And it looks actually, link actually to one of the things that Lucas said earlier on. But indebtedness, the ability to basically be able to borrow, has been the most important engine of growth in the past 30 years. If we didn't have the possibility of issuing debt, we wouldn't be able to buy houses, we wouldn't be able to grow as fast as we have in the past 30 years. But the fact remains that the higher the level of debts, the more likely they are to become problematic at some point, right? So you really need to think about debt and the effects that it has on our welfare as a ham shape. So, it goes up and it's fine for us, and then if it goes even more up, then it's not good for us anymore. The hump shape effect is an important effect, and of course the $1 million question is, at what point does it become bad? This is the issue that for the past 10 years we have all tried to answer. If you have debts above that, it's not a good idea, you should stop. If you're below that, it's good, you should lever more, because it really allows you to grow. But the fact of the matter is, the higher the debts, and we are now in this position where we think that we've actually tipped. We are now on the bad side of that story, and we really need to do something about it. But it doesn't correlate one-on-one, the level of indebtedness, with actually being bad. So it's not necessarily true that those who have high levels of debt are necessarily in trouble. And I'll say a little bit more about that. That's my motivation for doing that, for looking about this. And we have to think about indebtedness, not only now that we have to come down the hill, we have to think about how we prepare for debt when we're going up the hill. And that is, again, when we're levering up, financial education is really going to help us, in my view, to try and ensure that those debts that we do take remain on the good side of that curve, not on the bad side of that curve. These are the results of the previous survey. My data now is a little bit old, and it's telling us that it really is the advanced world that is more financially literate than the rest of the world. So, the typical countries are the ones that score the highest in this respect. And that actually tells you, I like this graph, it's a graph that simply plots the financial literacy score against GDP per capita, which is one way of identifying how rich a nation is. The orange triangles are those who are below the average. I'm just doing a very eyeballing data, and the blue are the ones that are above the average. And what you actually see is that financial literacy really is an instrument in countries that actually have financial undertakings. So, the most financially sophisticated countries are the ones who can actually benefit from understanding the workings of financial literacy. So if you're not engaged in financial sophistication, financial literacy is not going to really be an issue you should worry about. So it's telling us there really is a threshold effect. You become rich up to a point, then financial literacy can really be, without wishing to establish causality here, can be a measure of a tool in the many tools that one is using to think about progressing in welfare. And here I have a graph that I think Lucas might actually like, because it's a difficult graph, but it was very intuitive when we thought about presenting this. This is now European data, and what I'm plotting here again is financial literacy. I'm still in in the topic of what do we know about financial literacy. Financial literacy on the x-axis and then on the y-axis, I have the borrowing to savings ratio. So if I borrow 1, how much do I save? So to the extent that I have, let's say, 0.4 borrowing ratio to savings is I have borrowed half of all my savings. Okay? So the reason why I think this is interesting is because I'm asking the question, when you borrow, do you have assets to back this up with? And the more likely you are to have assets to back it up, the more likely that this debt will remain what I call productive debt. Good debt, on the good side of the graph. And what you see here is actually the financial literacy is going up with that ratio, which is actually very interesting, because the countries that are on the top are the countries whose debts are deemed to be the most productive. So if actually what this tells me, again, I'm perhaps making too much of one graph, is that those countries can actually capitalize on indebtedness, so benefit from indebtedness without jeopardizing the effects of running into unproductive systems. And financial literacy is part of what it helps them to get there. So I think that's one way of looking at it. And then there is a question, of course, between I always find that many people, certainly on my side of the field, confuse financial literacy with literacy. And they're not the same thing. They're correlated, but I just wanted to plot these graphs because I always use them to say they are actually different. Understanding, let's say, logarithms or understanding exponentials is not the same as making the right current account decision. So the way you put the knowledge to use is part of financial literacy. And I'm just here, these are the two graphs that are actually trying to convince people that it's not the same thing and you should not look at it as just teaching math. It's more to that than teaching math. Why do we care? We care because of many things. I have 3 here, is the ones that I discuss in the paper. But resilience in retirement, I am fascinated by some of the evidence, and I believe Anna Maria has worked on this. 30 to 40%, I think Anna is quoting in her paper, of the inequality in pension wealth that we find is accounted for by lack of financial knowledge. I find that a tremendous result, in particular in an aging society where we can rely less and less on the government to look after us, where we have to save very well in advance with huge discount factors in order to prepare for retirement. So this is a very compelling factor, in my view, for caring about resilience in retirement. Ensuring that we are on the right side of the debt is another one, and I have a number of graphs in the paper where I'm trying to motivate this, but financial literacy can help us ensure that we lever up productively as opposed to lever up unproductively. And finally, and this I will show you a few graphs on this, is on financial literacy and inclusive growth in Brussels. By Brussels, I mean in the European institutions, we have put mechanisms in place for monitoring countries in terms of their economic developments. Some believe that they may be a bit invasive, others think that they're necessary. But one thing that we pay less attention to is how far our economic measures affect social aspects. And we do have a couple of and if I may go straight to these graphs, we do have a couple of what we call social indicators, and I wanted to show you how much they correlate with financial literacy, even more actually with some of the economic outcomes, which is really quite telling. First on inequality, look at the relationship between inequality and financial literacy. You find those countries that have greater Gini coefficients are also the ones that are at the bottom of the financial literacy scale. And there is actually these indicators, which are very new indicators in the context of Europe. They are measuring vulnerability on the social side. There's the risk of poverty, which basically means if you are 60%, if you're below 60% of the national median in terms of disposable income, and then a risk of severe material deprivation on the right-hand side if you're not capable of buying certain goods that the Commission defines. And again, the correlations are very telling. The social risks of falling off the social platforms is not something that doesn't relate to financial literacy, and I think we need to think about that. And you get social mobility again in the context of the European Union. What should we do about it? There's many measures, and I think Anna Maria and many people have actually talked about this. Financial education at very early stages. This is a picture of homework of my, at the time, 6-year-old son, who goes to a Flemish school. We live on the Flemish side of Brussels, on the outskirts. They go to a sort of typical village Flemish school, and this is part of the first grade homework in their arithmetic class. They are learning to count up to 20 and to do manipulations up to 20, and they use currency to do that. These are the kids who are very digitally savvy. From the age of 3, they use tablets. From the age of 6, they learn how to use currency. In the summer, my son asked me, why is it that I pay with a card and I don't pay with money, given that they have spent so much time learning about this. I explained that you could do this digitally. And then, of course, the risks that come with this, and that links to what Anna said in her presentation, is that my son actually saw me putting the pin and said to me, that's the same pin as in the tablet. So I am now hiding. So I am now hiding my cards because it's very easy for him to take this card and pay. He can do it. But I mean, it's quite impressive how much you can actually learn simply by doing this simple exercise. So start as early as possible. Move away from one size fits all. It's not, we don't all have the same needs, and I offer them as a lifetime process. This is a very interesting research that comes from parts in the USA, where we say, you know, if I had the advice when I needed it the most, for example, when I make the biggest financial decision is when I buy a house, that would be a good thing. Provide tools for a better evaluate financial literacy, and here I'm pleading with Anna to do her survey in Europe so we have better numbers for Europe to control this. Increase private sector involvement. I have really admired the efforts of banks to inform about it, to engage in financial literacy issues. I think this is a great thing, but it's not sufficient, but it is a great thing. And then finally, we need to do more research. So that of course, I think we are in very good hands for that. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you.